Hey guys, Carl Boltzmann here. Welcome to the channel. This is the first video in a series of videos where I'm going to be taking a look at some of my favorite music. In this case, we're going to be looking at Building Steam with a Grain of Salt by DJ Shadow. Now, his album Introducing, which is behind me on the piano here, is a classic and one of my personal favorite albums. It came out in 1996, and what I want to explain is what makes this album so special and what makes this song in particular so special to me. Now, the album itself was the first album ever released that was made entirely from samples. And sampling is the art of taking somebody else's piece of music and taking a tiny piece of it, sampling that, and then taking other samples and combining it together to make something new and something different. DJ Shadow very intentionally used samples that were obscure from artists that got record deals in the 60s and the 70s, came out with albums, but it just never went anywhere. So they're songs that people never heard. They're albums that nobody ever heard. And he very intentionally went through thousands of records to find samples and breaks in these very obscure records, which makes this album all the more special because with the exception of, I believe, two well-known samples that he uses somewhere in this album, the rest are just very obscure, and it was almost like he is like a historian going into an archive, in his case, a record archive, which was the basement of this record shop in Sacramento, California. And he looked through all this historical documentation of people's music, and he found little pieces to tell little stories. And that's what this album is. And I highly recommend that you take a listen to it from front to back. You wouldn't just read one chapter in a book. You want to read it front to back. You want to get the full story. It's the same thing with this album. You want the full picture, and I'll have the link below. Now, I also want to say the project files I'm going to be using here will be available in a link below. And so if anybody wants to follow along with what I'm doing, feel free to do so. I also want to make this video accessible to those of you who aren't that familiar with recording and don't really know what a digital audio workstation is. What you're looking at here is Ableton Live, which is a modern DAW, we call it, or digital audio workstation. It's really made to sample music and to make that very easy. Now, DJ Shadow would have used an Akai MPC-60, which is a standalone sampling unit back in the early 90s to make Introducing, which makes this album all the more special because it would have taken so much more time for him to create the things that he did to make the songs that he did. Versus today, where I will show you in this video how easy it is for me to take the songs that he used and to sample them and to recreate Building Steam with a Grain of Salt. So like I said, what you're looking at here is the visual representation of Building Steam with a Grain of Salt. When I zoom in here, what you can see here are the volume changes. This is the left channel and the right channel. And these two black lines represent the volume of the left channel and the right channel. So I can tell right here that this is the intro to the song. And right here where it gets much larger, that's clearly where the drums come in. And you can kind of tell here's a bass drum here. It's a nice spike, a nice big attack, very loud attack. And then here's another bass drum and here's a snare. You're going to want to know these things because when we go and we kind of break down some of the songs that he sampled, you want to be able to visually see some of this stuff so you can kind of tell what I'm doing. So without further ado, let's start sampling some music. So let's start by listening to the intro of Building Steam with a Grain of Salt.
From listening to records,
So that great piano sample comes from a song called I Feel a New Shadow, written by Jeremy Storch, released in, I think, 1970. So let's have a quick listen to the intro of that song. And there are actually three samples that DJ Shadow took from this song. And the next one is the same piano riff, but with somebody singing over top. And then the last one is the low C right here at the end. let's go about sampling this. So I want to find the first note in the loop. So it's right there. And I'm going to cut that. And now we want to find the last note. Which appears to be right there. I should say actually right now that there are a number of different ways to do this in Ableton Live. This is the way that I've decided to demonstrate because I find it to be a very tactile method and something that you can do in any DAW. It doesn't have to be specific to Ableton Live. So I'm going to take this little clip that I've cut here and I'm going to copy it and paste it into its own clip. What I'm looking for here, I'm going to cut out the beginning. You can see the piano attack is right there. So I'm just going to bump up the beginning of my loop right to the beginning of that first piano note. And then right here at the end, I'm going to do exactly the same thing, but take away the following piano note at the end of the loop. And so what we're listening for is we want it to sound natural when it loops around. You don't want to click, and you don't want it to sound off as far as the BPM is concerned, as far as the beat is concerned. So let's have a listen. That's pretty good. When I listen to this versus DJ Shadows, we're going to notice a difference. His is a different pitch from ours, and it's faster too. And these two things are not coincidental. So the reason that that is the same reason why when you take a record player and you speed it up, the pitch gets higher. And obviously when you play a record really slow on a record player, the pitch gets very low. And it's the same thing here. And so what I can do here is I'm going to change this to repitch. Now when I change the tempo, the BPM, you can see it changes what it looks like here on the screen in the yellow there. So let's have a listen here. So it's much faster, much higher pitched. Slow it down a little bit. You can slow it down a lot if you want. And that's all cool if you want to manipulate this in some other way. But we're going to try to make this sound like DJ Shadows. His loop loops around right here. And I know this because I can see the grid in the background. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, which coincide with the BPM of Building Steam with a Grain of Salt. And that BPM is 164.5 or thereabouts. And so anyway, we want our clip to end right here. But you can see that it doesn't quite. It comes close, but it's not quite there. We are going to try to get it precisely on there. So that's a bit too far. So 158 and 159 is where it's in between. So I'm going to try 158.7, and that looks like it's right on the line there. It's perfect. So I'm going to cut this off. And now we can listen to our loop and see how it sounds. And DJ Shadows. So we got it, and that's great. And so I did the same process to get the other two samples from Jeremy Storch's I Feel a New Shadow. And the sample where the person is singing, I did the same thing. That is my demonstration of how he sampled the Jeremy Storch's I Feel a New Shadow to create the main backbone of Building Steam with a Grain of Salt. Now let's check out the drums. So the drums in Building Steam with a Grain of Salt are one of the aspects that make it so special and make it such a memorable song. It is said, or I've read anyway, that the drums are sampled from Frankie Say and the Soul Riders' Soul Food. Now, I cannot confirm that, and to be honest, when I listen to it, I sort of disagree with that assessment. I want you to take a quick listen here to this drum break in Soul Food versus Building Steam with a Grain of Salt. Okay, so what we're listening for is the ride of the cymbal and the bass drum and the snare. And if you can't pick these things out, that's okay. But if you can, awesome. And now listen to DJ Shadows. And to me, they sound different. Not just a little bit different, but fundamentally different. And so I can see why people think that this was sampled. But I'm not quite convinced. And I mean, honestly, if anybody has some insight on this, I would love to hear it. I am probably wrong. He probably did sample Frankie Say and the Soul Riders, and then there's some manipulation or resampling going on. But to my ear, it just doesn't sound close enough to the same sample for me to say that he sampled this. However, for this video, I am still going to sample Soul Food here to try to recreate the drums in Building Steam. So let's go ahead and I'll show you what I did. When at any time, and DJ Shadow would have done this too, he would have broken down that drum break into little pieces. So what that means is this is a bass drum right here. And then because the following part of the beat that I sampled didn't match up with DJ Shadow's, I found little parts that did. So here is a ride and a bass drum and a snare that followed up that bass drum. And so forth and so on. It's a bit of a time-consuming process. But here's what I ended up with without resampling the bass drum and the snare. So this is really just for the cymbal. And obviously the bass drum and the snare sound very weak there. So I just resampled the bass drum and the snare. Their qualities aren't exactly the same as Building Steam, but this is what I got. Now let's listen to Building Steam and compare. Ooh, this is such a good song. By the way, at this point, if you haven't listened fully all the way through Building Steam with a Grain of Salt, or all the way through introducing the whole album, please do. Please, after this video, go take a listen to it. It's totally worthwhile. That's so good. Okay, so one more comparison with mine. For the purposes of this video, I wasn't trying to get it exactly. I'm just trying to show you more or less what he would have done to create the elements in Building Steam. So let's move on to the drum solo. So before I play the drum solo, let's talk about it. This was released in 1996, so it was created in the early 90s. This really was kind of pushing the envelope of what was possible because, you know, he was using a standalone sampler, right? The Akai MPC-60. Other artists were using very primitive computers at that point, and with very limited RAM and hard drive space and everything else. It was very difficult to do back then. Let's take a listen to this solo. Yeah, I mean, it still really resonates with me today. This is what makes DJ Shadow, to me, such a good producer, is the amount of time and effort that he usually puts in to his creations. So what I'm going to show you now is how he would have made that solo. You can see this bass drum right here. That cut there. So what he's doing, here are my drums in the brown. And if I zoom in, I'm going to take this bass drum in the beginning right there, and I'm going to chop it up into 4. And I know the second 4 is a different bass drum. It's clearly this one. So I'm going to take that bass drum and chop that up. And let's take a quick listen. And his. Mine again. So he would have done this to make this solo. And honestly, today it is so easy that you can literally do this stuff on the fly. So I'm just going to demonstrate that right now with my version of Building Steam. possibilities are endless, and this is one of the things that makes producing music these days so much fun, is that you can do just about anything. And so anybody out there, that likes music and is considering getting into music production, just do it. It is so cheap by comparison to what it used to be, and it is so much fun, and it's just a great hobby to have. So that pretty much concludes my look at DJ Shadow's classic Building Steam with a Grain of Salt. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, consider hitting the subscribe button and giving it a like. I'm going to be making a lot more of this sort of content where I take a look again at some of my favorite music and I break it down. In fact, in the next video, I'm going to be taking Building Steam with a Grain of Salt, and I'm going to try to recreate it by playing the piano and the drums and using my voice. I'm going to try to get it close. We'll see how that goes. See you in the next video.